All right, so let's look at the dynamics of fear, because the fear has to do with this processing of error in particular. Who of you likes nice emotions, like not afraid of nice emotions? Some of you are quite afraid of nice emotions, aren't you? Like if they're really intense. How many are afraid of intense nice emotions? Okay. Yeah. So you can see that there's some issues there too, isn't there? Even experiencing nice emotions, sometimes we have fears as well. Right. So we need to find out what the source of those fears are. Right. Well, with fear, there's three primary responses. The first one is terror. How many of you have experienced terror in your lives? Yeah, quite a lot. Particularly when you're in your childhood. Yeah. Deep terror. Yeah. Terror is the kind of response where you just literally freeze, where you can't actually do anything, and you can barely even breathe sometimes. Now, to re-experience that, and that is something that you'll need to do if you have terror locked up inside of you, the only way to get through it is to actually breathe diaphragmatically. So that's one response, is terror. Terror will just freeze you in a situation. And it's always related to something in your childhood. Who's afraid of snakes like that? Quite a few? Or spiders? Or mice? I knew this lady who was so afraid of mice, she would collapse on the floor and have a fit, a seizure, as soon as she saw a mouse. And when we started tracing it back, it went back to her childhood and some sexual things that her brothers did to her with creatures. So you can understand why she has some very, very strong fears about like mice, and it was just a linkage straight back into a memory which she couldn't allow herself to experience even as an adult. She was in her 40s and she couldn't allow herself to experience that. So a lot of these events have linkages back into our childhood. So the first one is terror. The next one is what do we most often do when we're afraid? Run away. Or flee or flight. So the first one was terror. Terror is a very, very difficult emotion to allow yourself to experience. But it will be a necessary part of the majority of our progressions, because most of us at some point experience some childhood terror. Right? So the next one is, shall I call it flight? Okay, that's the one we do most of the time, isn't it? We're afraid of something, so we get away from it. You're afraid of a certain person, so you stay away from them. You're afraid of certain situations, so you don't involve yourself in those situations. You're afraid of anything that will access something inside of you emotionally, and so what we do is we stay away from it, we just flee them. And the third response is the anger response. Fight. So how many of you do that? As soon as something starts getting triggered, straight into wanting to... Yeah. Who are more of the flee kind? Yeah, no, so that's more... Okay. Yeah. But both are basically the same sides of... the opposite sides of the same coin, really. They're exactly the same thing. Fear being expressed differently. By the way, today with questions, you will need to keep them on topic. Alright? Not like our previous discussions.
Where does phobias fit into those three?
I'm talking firstly about when this fear was created in you. What we'll talk about in a minute is how we then emotionally go with these fears. And it's the emotional part of the fear that becomes the phobia. Right? So we'll talk about that and what doctors and professionals say about that and what God says about that as well.
Where does automatic pilot or dissociating from, like going into staying in it, but just in the spot, not running, not fighting, but disassociating, like
Usually if a person completely disassociates from an experience, then then there's a childhood terror triggering that. So if you go into just automatic pilot and you're not even conscious of what you're doing in that situation, then there's a childlike terror response happening behind the scenes. Yeah. Who's afraid even just talking about fear? Yeah. No? What are you feeling right now? So what's that? Isn't that fear? Can you see even just a discussion about fear can actually, I don't know, but I can feel most of your emotions at the moment. And your heart rates are a bit higher than normal. Right? And if you can just allow yourself to breathe. Right? Those of you whose heart rates aren't higher than normal, it's because you're in tune-out mode. Right?
Is anxiety?
And you're very used to it. Anxiety is a fear, yeah. So fears you could sort of have different gradations, if you like, of intensity. Just like anger has different gradations of intensity. So the highest intensity of anger might be like uncontrollable rage. The lowest intensity of anger might be just a slight annoyance. Right? Now with fear, the highest point of fear is terror. So in other words, frozen terror. And then the lowest point might be just mild anxiety. And there's a huge range in between there. Gary?
So you can use anger to cap fear.
We use anger to get away from our fear a lot of times because anger is a more powerful response. So none of you like experiencing a feeling of fear, do you? Like, we don't usually like it, right? And what we wanted to do today is come to actually love it. We want to do this with it, right? So that embrace it. That's what we want to do about our fear. But most of us are feeling like we can't do that. We want to what? Reject. We want to push our fear away from ourselves all the time. But fear is a very important part of your progression, and that's what we'll learn about today.